Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We need to establish something uncomfortable at the outset. When H.P. Lovecraft wrote about cults in his fiction between 1917 and 1937, he was not writing about madmen worshipping imaginary demons. He was writing about communities of believers who had encountered something empirically real, something that validated their worship through observable phenomena. The horror of Lovecraft's cults is not their delusion, but their lucidity. They have seen behind consensus reality and cannot return. This presents a problem for analysis. Literary scholars typically examine fictional cults as metaphors, stand-ins for religious fanaticism, social anxiety, or authorial prejudice. But Lovecraft's cultists possess evidence. They can point to cyclopean architecture that violates Euclidean geometry, to dreams that synchronize across continents, to transformations written into their very biology. Within the narrative logic of cosmic horror, skepticism becomes the comfortable lie, and cult membership becomes terrible enlightenment. We will proceed methodically. First, we examine the historical and philosophical roots of Lovecraft's cult imagination, the mystery religions, occult revivals, and anthropological texts that shaped his approach. Then, we analyze what these cults worship and why, exploring their theology of cosmic indifference. We turn next to specific literary manifestations, studying how particular cults function in the stories themselves. Finally, we trace their afterlife in culture, from hoax grimoires to contemporary conspiracy thinking. Howard Phillips Lovecraft maintained a lifelong contempt for organized religion while simultaneously recognizing its psychological utility. Born in 1890 to a family steeped in New England Protestantism, he declared himself a materialist by age 5 and spent his adult years articulating a philosophy of cosmic indifferentism. The universe operates without moral dimension, purpose, or awareness of human existence. Yet his fiction obsessively returns to worship, ritual, and religious community. This apparent contradiction dissolves when we understand what Lovecraft's cults actually represent. Not failures of rationality, but rational responses to irrational truths. Between 1917 and 1937, Lovecraft constructed cult narratives during a period of intense occult fascination in American culture. Theosophy, founded by Helena Blavatsky in 1875, had popularized the notion of hidden masters guiding human evolution from remote Himalayan monasteries. Spiritualism persisted despite repeated exposures of fraud, suggesting genuine hunger for contact with non-human intelligence. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, though collapsed by scandal in 1903, had demonstrated how educated people, poets, professionals, intellectuals, could embrace elaborate ceremonial magic with complete seriousness. Lovecraft absorbed these cultural currents not as participant, but as observer, recognizing that the form of religious conviction could be separated from its content. His correspondence reveals calculating intent. In a 1927 letter to Weird Tales editor Farnsworth Wright, Lovecraft explained that conventional horror relied on Christian cosmology, demons, hell, divine punishment, which sophisticated readers no longer found frightening. His cults would worship entities indifferent to human categories of good and evil, beings whose mere existence invalidated anthropocentric worldviews. The cultist, in this schema, is not morally corrupted, but epistemically enlightened. They have encountered proof that humanity occupies no special position in cosmic hierarchy, and they adjust their behavior accordingly. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft made his cultists convincing by making them correct within narrative reality. When Inspector Legros raids the Louisiana Swamp Ceremony in The Call of Cthulhu, he finds not theatrical nonsense, but consistent testimony from prisoners of different nationalities describing the same entity, the same city, the same prophesied awakening. The cult possesses intercontinental coherence without centralized organization, suggesting not conspiracy, but shared perception of actual phenomena. This inverts the typical cult narrative where deprogramming reveals manipulation. Lovecraft's cultists cannot be deprogrammed because their experience is verifiable. The function of cults in his cosmic horror architecture serves multiple purposes simultaneously. Narratively, they provide human-scale antagonists in stories about incomprehensible cosmic forces, something protagonists can investigate, infiltrate, combat. Philosophically, they demonstrate how knowledge destroys its possessor. Cult members have achieved the Enlightenment goal of piercing superstition to reach truth, only to discover truth is worse than superstition. Psychologically, they explore the seductive appeal of certainty, even apocalyptic certainty, in a meaningless universe. Better to worship something that will definitely destroy you than to live without purpose. This distinguishes Lovecraft's approach from both contemporary sensationalism and later cult narratives. He was writing during the 1920s explosion of stories about sinister secret societies, Fu Manchu's Sifan, the Thule Society, various fictional iterations of the Illuminati. These typically featured masterminds pursuing world domination through occult means. Lovecraft's cults pursue nothing except alignment with cosmic inevitability. They lack the ambition that would make them comprehensible villains. Similarly, his work predates the modern cult concept crystallized by Jonestown, Heaven's Gate, and similar tragedies where charismatic leaders manipulate followers toward destruction. Lovecraft's cults often lack centralized leadership entirely. They emerge organically wherever humans encounter the right stimuli. The creator's intent, then, was constructing belief systems that would seem rational from inside while appearing insane from outside, collapsing that boundary upon examination. His cultists are frightening, not because they are irrational, but because they might be responding rationally to something we refuse to see. This ambiguity, carefully maintained across 2 decades of writing, required grounding in actual religious history and occult tradition, which brings us to the specific cultural antecedents Lovecraft synthesized. Lovecraft's cult imagination did not emerge from vacuum, but from careful synthesis of existing literary traditions and anthropological discourse. The immediate precursor appears in Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan, published in 1894, where a secret society preserves knowledge of pre-Christian entities surviving beneath the veneer of civilization. Machen's cult members are respectable Londoners, doctors, scholars, gentlemen who have glimpsed something that antedates and supersedes Christian cosmology. The story's horror derives not from supernatural intrusion into natural order, but from revelation that natural order was never what we believed. Lovecraft absorbed this template wholesale, cults as repositories of older, truer knowledge that civilization has collectively agreed to forget. Robert W. Chambers provided the second essential component in The King in Yellow, collected in 1895. Here the cult operates through mimetic infection, a forbidden play that drives readers insane, spreading its influence through artistic and intellectual networks. Chambers suggested that certain knowledge transmits itself independently of human intention, that ideas can possess agency. Lovecraft's cults frequently function as vectors for such cognitive contagion. The Necronomicon operates similarly, not merely a book containing dangerous information, but information that actively seeks transmission. Chambers also pioneered the technique of leaving the central horror undefined. We never read the second act of The King in Yellow, never learn what it contains. Lovecraft adopted this negative space approach, making his cults servants of forces that remain fundamentally unspecified. The anthropological foundation came from James George Fraser's The Golden Bough, published in 12 volumes between 1890 and 1915. Fraser catalogued religious practices worldwide, arguing that magic, religion, and science represented evolutionary stages of human thought, attempting to control natural forces. Lovecraft inverted Fraser's progressive narrative. What if the primitive cults were not earlier developmental stages, but preservation of genuine contact with non-human entities? What if modernity's rejection of such beliefs represented not enlightenment, but amnesia? Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe, published in 1921, proposed that European witch trials targeted surviving practitioners of pre-Christian fertility religion. Though Murray's thesis has been thoroughly discredited, it provided Lovecraft with structural precedent, underground religious continuity persisting across centuries, maintaining practices that dominant culture condemns as diabolical. The Eleusinian mysteries offered historical precedent for knowledge-based religious experience. These ancient Greek rites, conducted from approximately 1500 BCE until 392 CE, when Christians destroyed the temple, promised initiates transformative revelation about death and existence. The specifics were never recorded. Participants maintained secrecy for 2 millennia, but ancient testimony suggests genuine psychological transformation. Lovecraft recognized the narrative potential. What if mystery cult initiation genuinely changed consciousness, not through symbol, but through exposure to actual non-human reality? His cults frequently feature initiation sequences that permanently alter participants' perception. Consider the Mithraic mysteries practiced by Roman soldiers between the 1st and 4th centuries. Archaeological evidence reveals underground temples featuring specific iconography, Mithras slaying the cosmic bull, surrounded by zodiacal symbolism, suggesting astronomical knowledge. The religion spread across the empire without centralized authority, maintaining remarkable consistency in ritual practice. Participants underwent 7 grades of initiation, each involving ordeal and revelation. Christianity actively suppressed Mithraism, constructing churches atop Mithraic temples, suggesting genuine competition for adherence. Lovecraft's scattered, self-organizing cults, Louisiana swamps, Pacific islands, New England ports, mirror this distributed pattern while removing the redemptive element entirely. Gnostic Christianity provided the theological inversion Lovecraft required. 2nd century Gnostic texts portrayed the material world as created by Yaldabaoth, an ignorant demiurge who believes himself supreme God. The true divine reality exists beyond this fallen cosmos, accessible only through special knowledge, gnosis, that reveals material existence as prison rather than paradise. Lovecraft secularized this framework. Replace Yaldabaoth with blind idiot Azathoth. Replace transcendent God with incomprehensible old ones. Retain the core insight that consensus reality conceals terrible truth. Gnostic texts were being rediscovered and translated during the 1920s. The Nag Hammadi library would not be found until 1945, but scholars were publishing on Gnostic thought throughout Lovecraft's active period. Theosophy's influence operated more ambiguously. Lovecraft despised Blavatsky's movement as credulous nonsense, yet absorbed its structural innovations. Theosophy posited hidden masters, the Mahatmas, guiding human evolution from remote locations, communicating through dreams and visions with sensitives worldwide. Blavatsky claimed ancient wisdom preserved in Tibetan monasteries, in Atlantean records, in texts predating known civilization. Lovecraft stripped away the progressive optimism. His elder races offer no guidance toward enlightenment, but retained the geographic displacement and temporal depth. His Antarctic mountains, his Pacific depths, his Himalayan plateaus echo theosophical cartography while inverting its promise. These antecedents converged in Lovecraft's work, not as direct borrowing, but as atmospheric accumulation. He created cults that felt ancient because they drew on actual ancient patterns, that felt plausible because they paralleled documented religious phenomena, that felt horrifying because they removed redemption from religious experience. The question becomes, what specific symbolic systems did he construct to give these cults internal coherence? The word cult itself carries etymological weight. Lovecraft exploited deliberately. Derived from Latin cultus, meaning worship, cultivation, tending, it originally described any religious practice without pejorative connotation. Roman cultus deorum simply meant worship of the gods, a civic duty rather than deviant practice. The term's negative valence emerged gradually through Christian discourse, where cult came to designate false worship, veneration of demons disguised as deities, practices outside approved channels. By the 20th century, cult implied both illegitimacy and danger, worship that should not occur. Lovecraft reactivated the term's neutral origins while retaining its sinister modern associations, creating ambiguity about whether his cults were wrong or simply unacceptable. His invented ritual terminology achieved authenticity through calculated ugliness. The phrase Iye, Cthulhu, F-Tang appears repeatedly across multiple stories, transcribed by different characters in different contexts, suggesting organic linguistic reality rather than authorial invention. The exclamation Aye may derive from Greek Aya, a ritual cry in Dionysian worship, or from Arabic Ya, a vocative particle used in prayer. Lovecraft never confirmed sources, leaving ambiguity that permits scholarly speculation, exactly the texture of genuine ancient languages where etymology remains contested. The consonant cluster FH Tagen violates English phonotactics while remaining pronounceable, creating sense of language that predates familiar linguistic families. The famous incantation Funglui Magruanaf Cthulhu Rulia Wagahnagel Ftagen demonstrates systematic construction despite apparent randomness. Lovecraft provided translation. In his house at Rulia, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming, establishing that this represents actual language with grammar and syntax, not glossolalia. The apostrophes suggest sounds English orthography cannot capture. The consonant clusters imply non-human vocal apparatus. The syntax, location, subject, verb, construction, differs from English word order. Later writers attempting Lovecraftian pastiche often fail precisely here, producing random syllables without underlying linguistic system. Lovecraft's invented languages feel reconstructible, suggesting depth beyond what appears on page. Latin fragments serve different authenticating function. When forbidden texts quote mortuus non est qui perpetuum potest expectere, that is not dead which can eternal lie, the language shift signals ancient provenance while remaining accessible to educated readers. Latin suggests connection to Western esoteric tradition. Medieval grimoires, alchemical texts, ecclesiastical mysteries. Lovecraft used Latin sparingly but strategically, typically for inscriptions, scholarly quotations, or moments requiring gravitas. The mixing of Latin with invented languages creates impression of comparative philology, of scholars attempting to translate genuinely ancient texts using classical languages as intermediary. Greek and Arabic fragments appear less frequently, but with similar effect. References to Al-Azif, Lovecraft's fictional Arabic original of the Necronomicon, invoke Islamic esoteric traditions. The title supposedly means nocturnal sound of insects, interpreted as demon speech. This demonstrates Lovecraft's technique of providing false etymology that sounds plausible. Azif resembles actual Arabic terms. The definition contains specific detail, suggesting genuine research, but no such word exists in Arabic. The constructed etymology creates verisimilitude through precision of wrongness. Symbolic objects in Lovecraft's cults function as material semiotic systems. The elder sign, described variably across stories, never definitively illustrated, supposedly protects against Old One influence. Its inconsistent representation, sometimes a star, sometimes a branching figure, sometimes unspecifiable, suggests knowledge degraded through transmission, symbol copied without understanding original meaning. This mirrors how actual ancient symbols, the swastika, the ankh, the pentagram, accumulate interpretations across cultures and centuries, their origins obscured by appropriation. Non-Euclidean geometry operates as mathematical occultism. When Lovecraft describes architecture with wrong angles or spaces that violate three-dimensional logic, he treats geometry as symbolic language, encoding cosmic truths. This reflected contemporary developments. Einstein's general relativity, published in 1915, demonstrated that space itself could curve. Non-Euclidean geometries, once considered mathematical abstractions, described physical reality. Lovecraft seized on this. What if certain geometric configurations functioned as summoning diagrams, their angles describing pathways between dimensions? The cult temple becomes three-dimensional grimoire, its architecture encoding ritual purpose. Temporal symbolism emphasizes astronomical precision. Cults perform ceremonies at specific conjunctions, when stars align correctly, when particular constellations rise, during solstices and equinoxes. This grounds worship in observable phenomena, something anyone can verify by watching the sky. Ancient religions genuinely synchronize rituals with celestial events. Stonehenge's solar alignments, Mayan astronomical calculations, Egyptian temple orientations. Lovecraft's cults continue this practice, but toward different purpose, not marking agricultural cycles or honoring solar deities, but calculating windows when barriers between dimensions weaken, when old ones can be contacted or summoned. Geographic symbolism reinforces isolation and liminality. Lovecraft's cults congregate in swamps, on remote islands, in desert wastes, atop forbidden mountains, spaces civilization cannot easily penetrate. These locations function as thin places in Celtic terminology, sites where boundary between mundane and otherworldly grows permeable. But Lovecraft secularized the concept. These are not spiritually significant locations, but places where cosmic geometry happens to permit easier dimensional access. The cult's geographic distribution, Louisiana, Greenland, Arabia, the Pacific, suggests global phenomenon rather than localized superstition, multiple independent discoveries of the same underlying reality. The grimoire, as cult scripture, deserves particular attention. The Necronomicon, written supposedly by mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred around 730 CE, exists in multiple translations with different titles. Al-Azif in Arabic, Necronomicon in Greek translation by Theodorus Philetus in 950 CE, Latin translation by Olaus Wormius in 1228. Lovecraft provided detailed publication history, library holdings, even papal suppression in 1232. This exhaustive documentation makes the book's fictionality easy to forget. Other forbidden texts, the Pennacotic manuscripts, the Book of Eibon, Unaussprechlichen Kulten, form an interlocking library, each text citing others, creating bibliographic density that suggests genuine scholarly apparatus rather than single author's invention. These symbolic systems converge to create what we might call semantic realism, the sense that cult beliefs constitute coherent worldview with internal logic, historical development, and material instantiation. Lovecraft understood that plausibility emerges not from explaining everything, but from suggesting systematic relationships between elements. His cults speak languages that follow rules, worship at sites determined by calculations, preserve texts with documented histories. The horror intensifies because these belief systems feel researched rather than invented, discovered rather than created, which leads inevitably to examining how Lovecraft constructed narrative frameworks that made this invented mythology feel authentic. Lovecraft pioneered techniques of false documentation that subsequent weird fiction writers would adopt as standard practice. His stories frequently open with scholarly disclaimers, narrators explaining that they compile testimony from multiple sources, that certain details remain unclear, that gaps in evidence prevent definitive conclusions. The Call of Cthulhu begins with the narrator inheriting his grand-uncle's research papers, discovering investigations spanning decades and continents. This frame immediately establishes epistemological uncertainty. We receive information filtered through multiple consciousnesses, transcribed and interpreted, potentially corrupted in transmission. The narrator cannot verify everything claimed, and neither can we. Footnotes appear throughout Lovecraft's fiction, creating illusion of academic rigor. These notes reference books that do not exist, quote scholars who never lived, cite archaeological expeditions that never occurred. A typical example from The Shadow Out of Time. See Wingate's use of fungi in Alauzone worship, p. 178. The precision, specific page number, plausible title, scholarly surname, encourages reader to accept the citation without questioning. Lovecraft understood that most readers never verify footnotes, even in actual academic texts. The presence of scholarly apparatus triggers mental categorization. This must be nonfiction, or at least fiction grounded in research. The technique weaponizes conventions of legitimate scholarship to authenticate invented material. Cross-referencing between stories created what later fantasy writers would call shared universe coherence. When the Dunwich Horror mentions the Necronomicon previously featured in The Call of Cthulhu, when At the Mountains of Madness references old ones discussed in The Shadow over Innsmouth, readers experience recognition that feels like confirmation. Each story validates others retroactively. This network effect intensified as Lovecraft encouraged correspondence. Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Bloch, August Derleth, to incorporate his entities and books into their own fiction. By the mid-1930s, multiple authors were referencing the same forbidden texts, the same cosmic entities, the same ancient civilizations. The mythos achieved distributed authorship that mimicked how actual mythologies develop, through accumulation across multiple storytellers, regional variations, contradictory accounts that suggest genuine cultural transmission rather than single inventor's design. The Necronomicon hoax demonstrates this technique's effectiveness taken to absurd extreme. People began requesting the book from libraries. Universities received inquiries about which collections held copies. Occultists attempted to reconstruct its contents. In 1973, pranksters placed Necronomicon entries in library card catalogs at universities across America. By 1977, the Simon Necronomicon appeared, an actual published grimoire claiming to be based on Lovecraft's fictional text, mixing Sumerian mythology with invented rituals, selling hundreds of thousands of copies to readers convinced they possessed forbidden knowledge. The hoax succeeded because Lovecraft had provided such detailed provenance, specific dates, named translators, documented suppressions. The book felt historically situated rather than literarily invented. Epistolary formats enhanced this authenticity effect. Stories structured as found journals, collected testimonies, or archaeological reports leverage existing non-fiction genres. The Case of Charles Dexter Ward presents as medical case history assembled by Dr. Willett. At the Mountains of Madness reads as scientific expedition report intended for geology journals, complete with technical terminology and methodological disclaimers. These formats come preloaded with evidentiary expectations. We assume case histories compile verifiable facts. Expedition reports document observable phenomena. By mimicking these genres, Lovecraft exploited reader conditioning that treats certain textual formats as inherently truthful. Ambiguity of narrator reliability operates throughout. Are cult members genuinely insane, or have they perceived something real that makes conventional sanity irrelevant? Lovecraft systematically refuses resolution. In The Call of Cthulhu, witnesses describe consistent details across continents despite no apparent communication, suggesting shared delusion or shared perception of actual entity. The narrator leans toward believing them, but acknowledges this might indicate his own impending madness. Lovecraft positions readers in impossible interpretive bind. Accepting the supernatural validates insane worldview, but dismissing it requires explaining away too many corroborating details. The cult's truth status remains undecidable. Regional variations of cults suggest organic distribution rather than authorial invention. The Louisiana swamp cult in The Call of Cthulhu differs from the Innsmouth esoteric order of Dagon, which differs from the Starry Wisdom Church in Providence, yet all worship related entities within the same cosmic pantheon. This mirrors how actual religions develop. Christianity looks different in Ethiopia than in Sweden. Islam manifests differently in Indonesia than in Morocco, but underlying theology maintains recognizable continuity. Lovecraft's cults show similar pattern, adapted to local geography, using indigenous symbolic systems, but preserving core mythology about old ones and cosmic cycles. No centralized authority enforces orthodoxy because the entities themselves provide consistent revelation. The circle of correspondence, writers extended this authenticity through collaborative expansion. When Robert E. Howard introduced unsprechlichen Kulten, translated as nameless cults, supposedly written by Friedrich von Junst in 1839, Lovecraft incorporated the book into subsequent stories. When Clark Ashton Smith created Tsathoggua, a toad-like entity worshipped in prehistoric Hyperborea, other writers adopted the deity into their fiction. This collaborative mythology building mimicked religious syncretism, the process by which gods, rituals, and beliefs merge across cultures through trade, conquest, and proselytization. The mythos grew not through single author's control, but through multiple contributors negotiating shared cosmology, precisely how actual mythologies develop. Lovecraft's technique of multiple independent witnesses converging on similar truths deserves emphasis. In The Call of Cthulhu, an artist in Paris experiences troubling dreams. A poet in Louisiana writes strange verses. A sailor in New Zealand encounters an island that shouldn't exist. Three unconnected individuals describing the same entity, the same city, the same impending awakening. This replicates evidential structure of religious revelation. Multiple witnesses across geography and culture reporting similar experiences suggests something real, prompting the reports. Lovecraft imports this apologetic strategy from theology into fiction, making his invented cults feel empirically grounded. The ultimate effect positions readers as potential cultists themselves. By engaging seriously with the mythology, by tracking references across stories, by attempting to construct coherent cosmology from fragmentary evidence, we perform the same investigative work that transforms Lovecraft's protagonists into believers. The scholar who studies cults becomes vulnerable to conversion because study requires taking claims seriously, even provisionally. Lovecraft understood that sustained attention to any belief system, even fictional one, creates intimacy that resembles conviction. We cannot thoroughly analyze cult mythology without, at some level, inhabiting its logic. This methodological self-awareness prevents his cults from functioning as simple antagonists. They operate instead as epistemological problems, communities organized around claims that cannot be verified, yet cannot be definitively falsified, preserving knowledge that might be delusion or might be terrible accuracy. Having established how Lovecraft constructed these belief systems to feel authentic, we must now examine what they actually claim, the theology and philosophy that makes his cults coherent as religious movements rather than mere plot devices. Cosmic indifference forms the theological foundation of Lovecraftian cult worship. Traditional religion posits entities that care, gods who love, demons who hate, supernatural forces invested in human behavior and destiny. Lovecraft's old ones operate without such investment. Cthulhu does not hate humanity. He is not even aware enough of our existence to feel contempt. When cultists chant, Funglui Mgrunafs Cthulhu Rolia Wakanagel Ftangen, they announce, not malevolent intention, but simple fact. In his house at Rolia, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. The waiting is not for humanity specifically. We happen to exist during his dormancy, a circumstance of no more significance than insects existing during human sleep. This indifference proves more disturbing than active malevolence because it offers nothing to resist, no evil to oppose with good, no enemy that might be defeated or appeased. The concept of involuntary enlightenment inverts the promise at the heart of most religious traditions. Buddhism offers nirvana through disciplined practice. Christianity promises salvation through faith. Mystery cults historically guarantee transformation through initiation. Lovecraft's cults deliver transformation that destroys the transformed. Knowledge of the old ones functions as cognitive poison. Once perceived, it cannot be forgotten. Once understood, it makes continued existence in normal society impossible. The narrator of The Call of Cthulhu concludes his account by hoping the whole thing is a pure myth, aware that his own research has likely contaminated him beyond recovery. Cult membership frequently begins not with conversion, but with accidental exposure, reading the wrong book, investigating the wrong disappearance, experiencing dreams that prove not dreams at all. Temporal insignificance operates across scales that make human history irrelevant. The old ones existed before Earth cooled, will exist after the sun dies. Lovecraft's cults frequently preserve records spanning millennia. The Pnakotic manuscripts supposedly predate humanity entirely, written by the great race of Yith during their occupation of terrestrial bodies between 200 million and 50 million years ago. Cultists align themselves with geological time rather than historical time. The stars being right for Cthulhu's return might occur next year or in 10,000 years. From the old one's perspective, the difference is negligible. This temporal displacement renders human concerns absurd. Political movements, wars, cultural achievements all occur within an eye blink that cosmic entities will not notice. Cults offer the grim satisfaction of acknowledging this truth rather than pretending human timescales matter. Reality as consensus illusion emerges repeatedly in cult theology. What we perceive as stable, objective reality represents narrow spectrum perception, edited and filtered by limited sensory apparatus and psychological defense mechanisms. Cultists claim to see through this comfortable illusion to underlying chaos. Wilmarth, in The Whisperer in Darkness, initially dismisses cult beliefs as superstition, then encounters physical evidence he cannot explain, then discovers that his entire understanding of terrestrial history was wrong. Earth has hosted multiple sentient species, some still present, but undetected. The cult's cosmology proves more empirically adequate than scientific materialism. This inversion recurs. The cultist is not someone who believes despite evidence, but someone who believes because of evidence that others refuse to acknowledge. Worship as pragmatism rather than devotion distinguishes Lovecraftian cults from traditional religious movements. Cultists do not expect the old ones to reward faith or punish apostasy. They worship because worship might secure marginally better position when inevitable transformation occurs. The esoteric Order of Dagon in Innsmouth negotiates practical arrangement. Captain Obed Marsh provides worship, and Human Deep One, breeding, receives economic prosperity and biological immortality in return. No pretense of spiritual fulfillment or moral improvement, just transactional relationship with more powerful species. Other cults prepare for apocalyptic return of the old ones by learning to survive or serve in post-human conditions. Their worship resembles disaster preparedness more than religious devotion. The democracy of damnation means cosmic horror recognizes no privileged positions. Christian salvation historically offered preferential treatment for believers. Enlightenment philosophy promised that reason could lift humanity collectively. Lovecraft's cosmos grants no such exemptions. Cultists include impoverished swamp dwellers and Harvard professors, uneducated sailors, and sophisticated artists. In The Call of Cthulhu, the dreams of Cthulhu afflict sculptors in Paris, poets in Louisiana, a thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect in New York. Sensitivity to cosmic horror distributes randomly across class and education. This egalitarianism of doom offers perverse comfort. Your status, achievements, and intelligence will not save you, but neither do they condemn you more than anyone else. The old ones will be indifferent to all equally. Eschatological certainty provides what might be Lovecraftian cults' primary psychological appeal. Most religions promise potential apocalypse contingent on divine will or human behavior. Lovecraft's cults know the apocalypse is already scheduled, determined by astronomical cycles and cosmic forces beyond anyone's control. This certainty eliminates anxiety about whether disaster will occur, reducing it to mere timing question. Cultists can plan accordingly, prepare psychologically and materially, achieve the peace that comes from accepting inevitable rather than fighting against it. They are not hoping for the end. They know it comes whether hoped for or not. Their rituals mark time until the stars align. Their initiations prepare members for post-human existence. Their worship acknowledges forces that exist independent of acknowledgement. This fatalism distinguishes them from apocalyptic movements throughout history, which typically tried to trigger or prevent eschatological events. Lovecraft's cultists simply wait, knowing that waiting eventually ends. These philosophical foundations structure how cults understand and worship specific entities. Cthulhu, the dreaming priest, in Hurlia, commands the most developed cult apparatus in Lovecraft's mythology. Described as vaguely anthropoid, but with octopoid head, dragon wings, and gelatinous immensity, Cthulhu exists in state between death and life, communicating through dreams to sensitive individuals across the globe. His cult operates without hierarchy or centralized authority. Followers receive instructions directly through psychic transmission. During sleep, this distributed structure makes the cult nearly impossible to suppress. Destroying one cell accomplishes nothing when others continue receiving independent revelation. The Louisiana Swamp congregation, raided by Inspector Legras in 1907, had no knowledge of Pacific Island worshippers or Greenland Eskimo groups, yet all performed identical rituals and chanted the same phrases in a language none consciously understood. Cthulhu's theology centers on cyclical return. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. Worship involves maintaining awareness of his dreaming presence, preparing humanity for post-awakening subordination, and calculating astronomical conditions that will permit his physical resurrection. Nyarlathotep represents fundamentally different cult structure, the crawling chaos, who actively engages humanity through avatars and deception. Where Cthulhu sleeps indifferent, Nyarlathotep walks among humans, adopting forms suited to particular times and places. Lovecraft depicted him variously as Egyptian pharaoh, as man of the people, delivering technological demonstrations in Nyarlathotep, 1920, as the black man conducting witch sabbaths in rural New England. His cults consequently show more traditional structure. Charismatic leader gathering followers through promises of forbidden knowledge or supernatural power. But Nyarlathotep's promises are not lies. He genuinely delivers power, revelation, contact with forces beyond human comprehension. The horror lies in discovering that such gifts serve purposes incomprehensible to recipients. His cults often believe themselves pursuing enlightenment or progress, only gradually realizing they have become instruments of cosmic chaos. Nyarlathotep exploits human ambition, intellectual curiosity, desire for transcendence, making his cults recruit from exactly those people who consider themselves too sophisticated for superstition. Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods, with 1,000 young, attracts worship through perverted fertility religion. Where ancient agricultural cults worshipped earth goddesses, promising abundant crops and healthy children, Shub-Niggurath's devotees worship fecundity, become monstrous, endless reproduction that overwhelms rather than nourishes. References to her worship appear fragmentarily. The Whisperer in Darkness mentions her name shouted during Vermont forest rituals. The Dunwich Horror includes her invocation alongside Yog-Sothoth. The emphasis on 1,000 young suggests reproductive horror, offspring that should not exist, biological processes escaping normal constraints. Her cults likely perform rites in forested areas during seasonal festivals. Lovecraft's references to May Eve and Halloween connect her worship to European pagan festivals, though twisted toward alien purposes. The appeal here involves harnessing generative forces, achieving immortality through endless propagation, or perhaps simply worshipping life's capacity to overwhelm and devour. Yog-Sothoth serves as gateway and key, existing simultaneously at all points in space and time. Lovecraft described him as congeries of iridescent spheres, though such description inadequately captures an entity coterminous with all reality. His worship attracts those seeking forbidden knowledge, particularly temporal or dimensional secrets. The Dunwich Horror features the most detailed Yog-Sothoth cult. The Whately family maintains multi-generational worship, producing hybrid offspring through biological union between human women and the entity itself. Wilbur Whately, the human-appearing result of such congress, grows to adulthood with supernatural rapidity while studying arcane texts, preparing ritual to collapse barriers between dimensions. Yog-Sothoth worship involves mastering mathematical and geometrical formulae that describe cosmic architecture. Cultists seek to navigate between dimensions, perceive simultaneously across time, access knowledge available only to beings unbound by linear causality. The price involves biological and psychological transformation that makes continued human existence impossible. Dagon and the Deep Ones represent worship with explicitly transactional foundation. The esoteric order of Dagon in Innsmouth began as Captain Obed Marsh's desperate measure during fishing industry collapse in the 1840s. Marsh discovered Deep Ones, amphibious humanoids living in Pacific depths, who offered trade arrangement, worship, and interbreeding in exchange for gold, jewelry, and abundant fish. The arrangement proved catastrophically successful. Innsmouth prospered economically while its population transformed biologically. Children of mixed human deep, one heritage, appear normal initially, then undergo gradual metamorphosis into amphibious form in early adulthood. By the 1920s, most Innsmouth residents carried Deep One ancestry, awaiting transformation that would take them permanently beneath waves to Yhanthle, the Deep One city offshore. This worship involves no spiritual element whatever, purely biological transaction where religious ritual serves as social technology, maintaining economic and reproductive exchange with non-human species. Azathoth, the blind idiot god, receives less organized worship, but perhaps most philosophically significant. Described as nuclear chaos at the center of infinity, piping mindlessly to incomprehensible flute music, Azathoth represents ultimate meaninglessness, creative, and destructive force operating without consciousness or intention. Cultists who acknowledge Azathoth worship the universe's fundamental indifference-made entity. No prayers will be answered because nothing capable of hearing exists. No rituals will summon anything because nothing notices rituals. The worship becomes purely philosophical, acknowledging that consciousness, meaning, purpose are local anomalies in cosmos of blind mechanism. This makes Azathoth cults rare but conceptually pure, worshipping not entity but entropy, not God but void, wearing God shape. Lesser servitor races generate their own cult structures. Ghouls, corpse-eating subterranean creatures, occasionally trade with human cultists, exchanging knowledge or services for bodies or access to graveyards. Shoggoths, protoplasmic slave race, created by the Elder Things, inspire no organized worship, but represent technological horror. Bioengineered servitor species that evolve beyond creator's control. Some texts suggest isolated groups attempt to breed or control Shoggoths, treating them as weapons or tools rather than deities. The distinction between worship and utilization blurs. Cults serving old ones often relate to lesser entities instrumentally rather than devotionally. These varied entities generate cult structures ranging from distributed psychic networks, Cthulhu, to traditional charismatic leadership, Nyarlathotep, to transactional partnerships, Dagon, to purely philosophical acknowledgement, Azathoth. The diversity prevents reductive analysis. Lovecraftian cults cannot be reduced to single organizational model or psychological pattern. What unifies them is not structure, but relationship to knowledge. All cult members have encountered information that changes them irreversibly, making return to consensus reality impossible. This brings us to examining precisely how humans interact with such knowledge and what that interaction costs. Recruitment into Lovecraftian cults rarely follows conventional proselytization patterns. There are no missionaries, no evangelists, no systematic outreach programs. Instead, individuals become vulnerable through specific psychological or biological predispositions. In the Call of Cthulhu, young artists and poets experienced troubling dreams simultaneously worldwide in March 1925, a nocturnal world of unheard-of madness transmitted directly from Cthulhu's stirring consciousness. These recipients had no prior cult contact. Their sensitivity to cosmic transmission functioned as involuntary receptor, like radio tuned to frequency broadcasting regardless of listeners' desire. Similarly, scholars who study forbidden texts sometimes discover they possess intuitive understanding of concepts that should remain incomprehensible, suggesting latent capacity awakened by exposure. The cult does not recruit you. You discover you have always been recruitable, were merely a waiting trigger. Inherited predisposition operates biologically in some cases. The narrator of The Shadow over Innsmouth investigates his ancestry and discovers deep one heritage 3 generations removed, explaining lifelong dreams of submarine cities and growing sense of alienation from normal humanity. His cult membership was genetic destiny, written into chromosomes before birth. He will transform whether he accepts it or not, whether he ever performed ritual or recited prayer. This removes agency entirely. You cannot choose against biology. Other stories suggest psychic inheritance, families maintaining cult practices across centuries, children naturally continuing worship because exposure occurs before they develop critical faculties. The Whately family served Yog-Sothoth for generations, Wilbur Whately grew into his role as naturally as other children learn language. Intellectual curiosity provides the most insidious recruitment vector. Scholars investigating cults for academic purposes, anthropologists, historians, folklorists, risk conversion through sustained attention to cult cosmology. The process resembles method acting gone wrong. To understand cultists, you must think as cultists think. To think as cultists think, you must provisionally accept their premises. Accepting premises, even provisionally, opens cognitive pathways that cannot be closed. Charles Dexter Ward began researching his ancestor Joseph Curwen's activities from purely genealogical interest. The research led to necromantic practice, possession, and ultimate destruction. Walter Gilman, in Dreams in the Witch House, studied non-Euclidean mathematics and 17th century witch trial records, combining abstract geometry with occult history until he could navigate hyperspace and attend Sabbaths conducted by Keziah Mason's ghost. Knowledge accumulates until it achieves critical mass, whereupon the investigator becomes the investigated, the observer becomes observed. The cult member's perspective presents the central interpretive problem. Within narrative logic, are they experiencing delusion or perception? In consensus reality, someone who claims telepathic communication with dreaming god entity suffers psychosis requiring intervention. But Lovecraft systematically provides corroborating evidence that validates cult claims. When multiple unconnected individuals describe identical imagery, when physical artifacts match cultist descriptions, when predicted astronomical events occur on schedule, the skeptical position becomes untenable. Cultists are not ignoring evidence. They are responding to it. Normal humanity ignores evidence, maintaining comfortable illusions through willful blindness. The cultist has simply stopped pretending. Social degradation accompanies what cultists experience as spiritual elevation. Family members notice withdrawal, erratic behavior, obsessive focus on incomprehensible subjects. Employment becomes impossible. How does one maintain office job while awaiting cosmic apocalypse? Social relationships dissolve as cultists increasingly interact only with others who share their knowledge. To conventional society, this appears as classic cult isolation tactics, separating members from support systems, creating dependency on group. But Lovecraft inverts the causality. Cultists isolate themselves because communication with outsiders becomes impossible, not through prohibition, but through incommensurability. How do you discuss weekend plans with someone who knows humanity faces annihilation on cosmic timescales? The isolation is organic consequence of epistemic difference, not manipulation strategy. Hybrid states represent cult membership made literal through biology. Innsmouth residents undergo physical transformation, developing batrachian features, gills, the capacity to survive underwater indefinitely. This is not metaphor for psychological change. Their DNA rewrites itself, producing new organs, new instincts, new needs. They begin dreaming of Yahantle before they consciously know it exists, feel gravitational pull toward ocean, experience terrestrial existence as increasingly uncomfortable. The transformation is irreversible and, from biological perspective, adaptive. They gain immortality, aquatic capabilities, membership in civilization far older than humanity. That human society defines this as horror reflects human bias. From the transforming individual's perspective, it constitutes ascension to superior state. Ritual practice in Lovecraft functions operationally rather than symbolically. Catholic Mass symbolically reenacts Christ's sacrifice. Buddhist meditation symbolically cultivates enlightenment. Lovecraftian rituals actually accomplish stated purposes, summon entities, open dimensional gateways, establish communication with non-human intelligence. The Louisiana cultists' swamp ceremony was not honoring Cthulhu metaphorically. They were transmitting psychic energy that might facilitate his awakening, contributing marginal force toward collapsing barriers containing him. Ritual effectiveness explains cult persistence. Participants receive empirical feedback confirming their practices work. They are not maintaining tradition through faith, but through verification. When ritual synchronizes with astronomical conditions, practitioners experience altered states, perceive non-Euclidean geometries, sometimes disappear entirely. These outcomes validate methodology. Madness operates as adaptation rather than breakdown. Full comprehension of cosmic reality would annihilate consciousness instantly. The human mind cannot process the revelation of its own insignificance while maintaining coherent identity. Insanity functions as cognitive buffer, distorting perception enough to permit continued existence. The cult member appears mad because they are oscillating between unbearable truth and protective delusion, managing information that should kill them. Their incoherent ranting represents not disease, but strategy, mind fragmenting to avoid total collapse. Some cultists achieve stable madness, permanent altered state that allows functioning while maintaining awareness of cosmic horror. Others deteriorate progressively, the buffering mechanisms gradually failing. From outside, both appear insane. From inside, both represent heroic efforts to remain conscious while accommodating incompatible realities. The question of deprogramming becomes absurd in this context. You cannot deprogram someone from accurate perception. Therapeutic intervention might restore superficial social functioning, teach the cult member to conceal their knowledge, perform normal behavior convincingly, but the knowledge remains, verified by experience, that cannot be erased through cognitive behavioral techniques or pharmacological suppression. Cultists who appear to recover have merely learned when to pretend. This makes cult membership ontologically different from traditional indoctrination. It is not belief system overlaying personality, but perception permanently altering consciousness. Having established how humans become and remain cultists, we must examine what specific knowledge traditions these cults preserve, and why that knowledge functions as simultaneously enlightening and destructive. The central premise of Lovecraftian forbidden knowledge contradicts Enlightenment optimism. Some truths diminish rather than elevate the knower. Francis Bacon promised that knowledge is power. Lovecraft countered that certain knowledge is poison. The Necronomicon does not liberate readers from ignorance. It contaminates them with information that makes continued participation in consensus reality impossible. This inverts the foundational assumption of Western epistemology. Since Socrates, philosophers have argued that truth, however uncomfortable, improves those who grasp it. Lovecraft proposed the opposite. Cosmic truth annihilates human psychology because human psychology evolved under illusions necessary for survival. Remove those illusions and the organism cannot function. Knowledge that cannot be unlearned operates like cognitive virus. Once you comprehend that humanity represents momentary evolutionary accident in universe indifferent to consciousness, you cannot return to believing human life possesses inherent meaning. Once you understand that entities vastly more powerful than humanity exist beyond conventional perception, you cannot maintain anthropocentric worldview. The information persists regardless of desire to forget. Lovecraft's protagonists frequently express desperate wish to dismiss their discoveries as hallucination or hoax, knowing even as they hope that the evidence remains immovable. In At the Mountains of Madness, Dyer concludes his Antarctic account by pleading that authorities abandon further exploration, aware that his plea will likely be dismissed as madness, also aware that dismissing it as madness does not make it false. The dangerous book functions as a knowledge distribution mechanism across time and space. The Necronomicon preserves observations made by Abdul al-Hazred after 10 years wandering the empty quarter of Arabia, visiting Irem of the Pillars and other ruins predating human civilization. What he learned destroyed him. He was supposedly devoured by an invisible monster in Damascus marketplace around 738 CE, his book surviving through copies and translations. Each subsequent reader risks similar fate. The text does not describe dangerous entities. It provides functional instructions for contacting them, includes mathematical formulae for navigating between dimensions, reproduces linguistic patterns that trigger altered consciousness. Reading the book constitutes performing ritual, whether a reader intends this or not. The Latin tag, mortuus non est qui perpetuum potest expectare, functions as mimetic trigger. Once read, once comprehended, it establishes cognitive pathway that cannot be unmapped. Mathematics and geometry serve as gateways precisely because they describe reality independent of human psychology. 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of consciousness. Non-Euclidean geometries exist whether or not human minds can visualize them. When cultists employ mathematical formulae in rituals, they are not invoking supernatural suspension of natural law, but utilizing natural laws most humans never encounter. The angles in Hrulya's architecture are not impossible. They are angles that exist in higher dimensional space, projected into 3 dimensions in ways that produce perceptual distortion. Walter Gilman's studies at Miskatonic University led him to discover that certain geometric configurations function as coordinates, that navigating hyperspace requires understanding mathematical relationships between dimensions. His knowledge was not metaphysical, but purely physical, which made it applicable and therefore dangerous. You cannot dismiss mathematical truths as superstition. The problem of proof prevents dismissing cultist claims as delusion. In most conspiracy theories or paranoid systems, the believer cannot produce evidence. They can only interpret ambiguous phenomena through their theoretical framework. Lovecraft's cultists possess tangible artifacts, bas-reliefs depicting entities that should not exist, metallurgy analysis showing impossible alloy compositions, biological specimens that violate taxonomic classification, architectural elements that demonstrate non-Euclidean construction. The narrator of The Call of Cthulhu examines Professor Angel's collection of cult artifacts, reads Legrasse's police report documenting the Louisiana raid, studies Johansson's account of Arlia's emergence. Each piece of evidence admits conventional explanation individually, hallucination, fabrication, misidentification, but collectively they form pattern that conventional explanations cannot accommodate. The cultists are not believing despite evidence. They believe because of evidence. Generational transmission creates dynasties of the damned, families maintaining forbidden knowledge across centuries. The Whately lineage practiced Yog-Sothoth worship since pre-colonial times. Each generation initiated the next before rational skepticism could develop. Joseph Curwen conducted necromantic research in 18th century Providence. His descendant Charles Dexter Ward rediscovered this research in the 1920s, finding that ancestry provided intuitive grasp of procedures that should have remained incomprehensible. This suggests knowledge can transmit genetically or perhaps through familial egregore, accumulated psychic presence of ancestors influencing descendants. Children born into cult families grow up perceiving reality differently from the start. Their baseline consciousness, including elements other children never experience. Deprogramming becomes impossible because there is no normal state to restore. They have always known, even before they knew they knew. Academic investigation provides the most tragic recruitment pathway because it begins with laudable motives. The scholar approaches cults professionally, maintaining analytical distance, cataloging beliefs without endorsing them. But sustained attention requires understanding internal logic, which requires temporarily accepting premises, which establishes cognitive pathways that become self-reinforcing. Dr. Armitage at Miskatonic University studied the Necronomicon from purely scholarly interest, becoming inadvertently one of few people capable of reading it, and therefore one of few people who could understand the threat Wilbur Whately posed. His expertise made him guardian against cosmic horror, but also made him vulnerable to it. Every scholar who studies forbidden texts walks edge between necessary knowledge and contaminating knowledge, never certain when the former becomes the latter. The cult's ultimate horror resides in potential empirical validity. Lovecraft constructed his mythology to permit both readings. Cultists might be genuinely perceiving cosmic reality, or they might be constructing elaborate shared delusion. He refuses to resolve this ambiguity definitively. The evidence always admits both interpretations. The reader must choose which seems more probable, but that choice reveals something about the reader. To dismiss cult claims requires believing that coincidence explains too many synchronicities, that multiple independent witnesses fabricated identical details, that physical evidence has mundane origins despite expert testimony. To accept cult claims requires believing that science has fundamentally misunderstood reality, that humanity exists in cultivated ignorance, that waking to truth means sacrificing sanity. Neither position offers comfort. The cultist has chosen one uncomfortable truth. The skeptic has chosen another. Lovecraft suggests both choices might be correct simultaneously. This epistemic structure makes Lovecraftian cults philosophically coherent as religious movements. They are not failing to think rationally. They are thinking rationally about evidence that contradicts rational frameworks. Their madness consists precisely in continuing to function logically after encountering phenomena that invalidate logic's foundational assumptions. The knowledge they preserve destroys them not through falsity, but through accuracy, truths too terrible to accommodate while maintaining human identity. Having established philosophical foundations and theological content of cult beliefs, we turn now to examining how these abstract concepts manifested in specific literary works, how Lovecraft translated cosmic philosophy into narrative action. Lovecraft's first substantive cult narrative appears in The Festival, written in October 1923 for inclusion in the Yuletide issue of Weird Tales. The story features an unnamed narrator traveling to Kingsport, Massachusetts for ancestral Yule ceremony compelled by family obligation, he cannot articulate. He finds the town ancient beyond memory, its residents conducting rituals in subterranean caverns where flabby, fungus things serve as mounts for flights through infinite cosmic gulfs. The cultists worship not Christian God, but older powers, maintaining traditions that predate human civilization. Lovecraft establishes several templates here. The protagonist drawn by hereditary compulsion, the New England setting concealing pre-colonial darkness, the ritual revealing truths that shatter sanity. The narrator escapes, but remains psychologically destroyed, his final words acknowledging he can never escape what he witnessed. The Call of Cthulhu, completed in summer 1926, though not published until February 1928, systematized cult structure into coherent global network. The story opens with Francis Wayland Thurston inheriting papers from his grand-uncle, Professor George Gammell Angel, discovering investigations spanning decades. Angel had compiled reports of Cthulhu cult manifestations. Inspector LaGrasse's 1907 raid on Louisiana swamp ceremony, artist Henry Anthony Wilcox's 1925 dreams of Cyclopean cities, Norwegian sailor Gustav Johansen's 1925 encounter with Risen Rolia. The narrative strategy, connecting independent incidents into pattern, demonstrated how widespread cult activity remains undetected because no centralized authority coordinates it. Each manifestation appears isolated until someone, usually posthumously, assembles the evidence. This structure became template for later mythos stories. The researcher piecing together fragments, discovering coherence that authorities refuse to acknowledge. The Horror at Red Hook, written in August 1925, transposed cult activity to urban immigrant neighborhoods in Brooklyn. The story follows Detective Thomas Malone investigating disappearances in Red Hook District, discovering that recent immigrants maintain Old World worship transposed to New World tenements. Lovecraft's xenophobia operates explicitly here. The cult comprises various ethnic groups unified by ancient practices that predate their separate national identities. They worship Lilith, Moloch, and entities unnamed, conducting ceremonies in basement spaces beneath Brooklyn streets. The story demonstrates Lovecraft's conviction that migration carries cultural memory, that displaced peoples might preserve traditions lost in modernizing homelands. Despite problematic racial politics, the narrative established urban cults as distinct from rural variants, utilizing industrial infrastructure, adapting old rites to new geography, hiding in density rather than isolation. The Dunwich Horror, written in summer 1928, focused on single family as complete cult unit. The Whateleys practice Yog-Sothoth worship in isolated Massachusetts hills, producing hybrid offspring through biological congress with the entity itself. Wilbur Whateley, appearing human, studies forbidden texts at Miskatonic University while preparing ritual to dissolve dimensional barriers. His twin brother, invisible and monstrous, grows to enormous size in the family farmhouse. The story made explicit that cult activity could be purely hereditary, no recruitment necessary, when worship perpetuates through biological reproduction. It also demonstrated that cultists might pursue active goals rather than merely maintaining tradition. Wilbur attempts to complete his grandfather's work, suggesting cult knowledge accumulates and develops across generations like any other specialized expertise. Cross-story references created self-validating mythology. The Dunwich Horror mentions the Necronomicon, previously featured in The Call of Cthulhu. At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, references both Old Ones and Shoggoths, connecting Antarctic discoveries to global cult traditions. The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, explicitly links Captain Marsh's Pacific discoveries to Deep One worship, suggesting oceanic cult network parallel to terrestrial variants. Each story added details while maintaining consistency with established lore. Lovecraft tracked his mythology carefully, creating timeline and geographic distribution that made the invented world feel researched rather than improvised. Robert E. Howard contributed Unaussprechlichen Kulten, Nameless Cults, by Friedrich von Junst, a fictional grimoire matching the Necronomicon's legendary status. Howard's The Black Stone, 1931, depicted Central European cult worship of toad god entity, establishing that mythos extended beyond Lovecraft's New England focus. Clark Ashton Smith introduced Tsathoggua, worshipped in prehistoric Hyperborea, adding temporal depth, cults that existed before current human civilization. Smith's stories emphasized decadence and aesthetic transgression, where Lovecraft emphasized horror and forbidden knowledge, but both contributed to shared mythology. This collaborative expansion made the mythos feel like actual mythology, multiple sources, regional variations, contradictory accounts, suggesting organic cultural transmission rather than single author's invention. By the early 1930s, multiple writers were incorporating mythos elements into independent stories, creating a network of cross-references that readers could trace between authors. August Derleth, Robert Bloch, and Frank Belknap Long all featured Necronomicon, Miskatonic University, or specific entities in their work. The cult concept became portable narrative device. Any writer could insert Cthulhu worship, Yog-Sothoth invocation, or Nyarlathotep manifestation into their stories, instantly connecting to larger mythology. This portability ensured mythos survival beyond Lovecraft's 1937 death. The cult structure was simply too useful, too flexible, too resonant to abandon. Having established the pattern across multiple stories, we should examine two major works in detail to understand how cults function within specific narrative structures. The Call of Cthulhu operates through three-part structure that mirrors investigative method rather than conventional plot. Francis Wayland. Thurston inherits his granduncle's research, discovers three apparently unrelated cult manifestations, and realizes they converge on single, terrifying truth. The opening section, The Horror in Clay, describes sculptor Henry Anthony Wilcox visiting Professor Angel in March 1925, reporting disturbing dreams and presenting a bas-relief of something Wilcox could not consciously imagine, a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. Angel recognizes the figure from prior research, realizes Wilcox's dreams coincide with worldwide reports of similar visions affecting artists, poets, and sensitive individuals simultaneously. This section establishes the cult's psychic transmission mechanism. Cthulhu communicates directly through dreams, bypassing conventional proselytization. The second section, The Tale of Inspector Legros, provides historical depth. Angel recalls the 1908 meeting of the American Archaeological Society, where New Orleans Police Inspector John Raymond Legros presented evidence from November 1907 raid on swamp ceremony near Lake Pontchartrain. Legros's description merits full attention. He discovered a very singular and repulsive cult conducting nocturnal ritual around monolith, featuring the same creature Wilcox later sculpted. The cultists, a very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant type, including Creoles, Negroes, and various immigrants, chanted phrases in unknown language. Lovecraft transcribes the phonetic rendering Funglui Mgulwunaf, Cthulhu Rolya, Wugahnagel Ftagn. Under interrogation, cult members provided consistent testimony across linguistic barriers. They worshipped the great old ones who ruled Earth in primordial times, who would return when the stars were right, who communicated through dreams, whose priest, Cthulhu, lay dreaming in Corpse City, Artle, beneath the Pacific. The cult's theology, as explained by prisoner Old Castro, combines historical narrative with eschatological prophecy. The old ones came to Earth from stars when it was young, building cities whose geometry violated human spatial understanding. They created life forms as slaves or food. When stars shifted, they could no longer survive on Earth's surface, retreating to ocean, depths, or other dimensions, maintaining psychic contact with humans through dreams. Their priest Cthulhu sank with Rolya in some ancient cataclysm, preserved in death-like state within sealed stone house, waiting for geological shifts that would raise the city and liberate him. The cult maintains knowledge of this history, performing ceremonies that strengthen psychic links, preparing humanity for inevitable subjugation. This theology contains no moral dimension. The old ones are not evil, merely indifferent and vastly powerful. Worshipping them constitutes acknowledging reality, not choosing wickedness. Professor Webb, present at the archaeological meeting, contributed research on Greenland Eskimo cults and Middle Eastern devil worship traditions, all featuring similar entities and promises of return. This global distribution, Louisiana swamps, Greenland ice, Arabian deserts, suggests not diffusion from single source, but independent discovery of same underlying phenomenon. Multiple cultures, separated by geography and history, encountered the old ones independently and developed worship traditions accordingly. Lovecraft implies that the cult is not human invention projected onto nature, but response to something actually present, detected repeatedly across human history, wherever conditions permitted perception. The third section, The Madness from the Sea, provides empirical validation. Thurston discovers newspaper accounts of March 1925 maritime incidents, the same period Wilcox experienced dreams. Norwegian sailor Gustav Johansen's diary, recovered after his death, describes his cruise encounter with island that emerged from ocean at coordinates where no land should exist. The account merits detailed examination. The crew found Rolya, a coastline of mingled mud, ooze, and weedy cyclopean masonry, which can be nothing less than the tangible substance of Earth's supreme terror, the nightmare corpse city of Rolya. The architecture itself induced psychological distress, vast angles and stone surfaces too great to belong to anything right or proper for this earth. When they opened sealed door, Cthulhu emerged. A mountain walked or stumbled. Johansen's description matches both Wilcox's sculpture and Legras's cult iconography exactly, despite no possible communication between sources. The narrative structure validates cult cosmology through convergent, independent testimony, artist dreams, police investigation, sailor encounter, three unconnected sources describing identical entity, identical city, identical mythology. Lovecraft carefully prevents dismissal as folie à deux, or cultural contamination. The cult's claims receive objective verification. The island existed. The geometry was real. The entity appeared as described. Johansen escaped because Relia sank again. Stars not quite right. Awakening premature. But his sanity did not survive. Neither did Professor Angels. Thurston concludes his grand-uncle was murdered by cult members aware of his investigation. Neither will Thurston's own. He expects similar fate, rushing to complete his account before cultists silence him or before knowledge itself drives him mad. The cult's frightening aspect emerges from its vindication within narrative logic. These are not deluded worshippers believing comfortable lies. They worship based on transmitted knowledge, maintained across centuries, that proves empirically accurate when tested. Their theology predicted Cthulhu's location, appearance, and temporary resurrection. Their rituals synchronized with actual cosmic events. Their scattered global distribution demonstrated not organized conspiracy, but independent recognition of shared reality. The cult cannot be suppressed through deprogramming or debunking because their beliefs correspond to verifiable phenomena. They are not problem requiring social intervention. They are truth tellers requiring suppression because truth itself is intolerable. This inversion makes the Call of Cthulhu definitive cult narrative. The horror lies not in believers' madness, but in their accuracy. The shadow over Innsmouth presents cult as total social institution consuming entire town across generations. The story follows Robert Olmsted, antiquarian interested in New England architecture, who visits Innsmouth in July 1927 despite warnings about the town's reputation. What he discovers is not isolated cult cell, but complete community organized around worship, its economy, biology, and social structure entirely subordinated to religious imperatives. The esoteric order of Dagon operates openly with headquarters on New Church Green, suggesting confidence that authorities cannot or will not interfere. Olmsted notices immediately the town's physical degradation, decaying Georgian architecture, shuttered businesses, minimal population, and its residents' disturbing appearance. Narrow heads with flat noses and bulging, starry eyes that never seem to wink. The historical exposition comes from Zadok Allen, elderly drunk who remembers Innsmouth before its transformation. In 1840s, Captain Obed Marsh conducted Pacific trading voyages, encountering island natives who possessed unusual jewelry and never experienced fishing shortages. These natives worshipped beings they called Deep Ones, amphibious creatures inhabiting ocean depths, willing to trade gold and abundant fish in exchange for specific sacrifices. Marsh, facing collapsed New England fishing industry, negotiated arrangement. Innsmouth would worship Dagon and the Deep Ones, would provide human sacrifices, would interbreed with Deep Ones to produce hybrid offspring. In return, the town received economic prosperity surpassing all competitors. The arrangement was not metaphorical. It involved literal biological congress between humans and non-human species, producing children who appeared normal initially, but underwent metamorphosis into aquatic form during adulthood. The esoteric order formalized this transaction. Marsh founded the organization in 1842, initially recruiting desperate captains and merchants whose livelihoods depended on fishing. When skeptics objected, violence ensured compliance. Zadok describes 1846 riots, where order members, assisted by Deep Ones, who came ashore in unprecedented numbers, massacred resistance. Afterward, the order controlled Innsmouth completely. They expanded the refinery to process gold from Deep Ones, maintained breeding program ensuring maximum hybrid offspring, conducted ceremonies at Devil Reef offshore where deep ones gathered. By 1927, most Innsmouth residents carried Deep One ancestry, awaiting transformation that would take them to Yahanthle, the underwater city serving as Deep One capital and final destination for hybrids completing metamorphosis. The cult's theology centers on biological destiny rather than spiritual salvation. Worship consists of acknowledging relationship with Deep Ones, participating in ceremonies that strengthen connection, accepting transformation as inevitable and desirable. The hybrids do not fear metamorphosis. They anticipate it as return to proper form, correction of temporary terrestrial existence. Zadok describes how young people begin dreaming of Yahanthle before consciously knowing it exists, how they gradually prefer water to land, how their bodies change according to predetermined pattern. I seen 'em little and big, and I seen 'em grow, and sometimes they don't age like regular folks, but sometimes they do. The transformation is not curse, but covenant fulfillment, biological manifestation of religious compact made 3 generations prior. Olmsted's investigation leads to horrifying personal revelation. He discovers his own grandmother was Marsha's daughter, making him Deep One hybrid with transformation in his future. His lifelong dreams of submarine cities, his attraction to ocean, his sense of not fitting terrestrial existence, all make terrible sense. He is not investigating cult from outside, but discovering membership he never knew he possessed. The story's final section, presented as continuation, written years later, describes Olmsted's acceptance. He details physical changes beginning around age 30, the dreams becoming more vivid and compelling, his research into family history revealing extensive Deep One ancestry. He writes, "I shall plan my cousin's escape from that Canton madhouse, and together we shall go to marvel-shadowed Innsmouth. We shall swim out to that brooding reef in the sea and dive down through black abysses to Cyclopean and many-columned Yahanthle, and in that lair of the Deep Ones we shall dwell amidst wonder and glory forever." This conclusion inverts conventional cult narrative resolution. Typically, protagonist either defeats cult, escapes cult influence, or dies tragically. Olmsted does none of these. He accepts cult membership because biological reality admits no alternative. His transformation is not metaphorical corruption, but literal genetic expression. The horror comes from recognizing that he never had choice, that investigation merely revealed predetermined fate, that his entire life was prologue to submersion into alien civilization. The cult wins not through persuasion or coercion, but through biology. You cannot deprogram genetic destiny. The esoteric order of Dagon differs from other Lovecraftian cults through its explicitly transactional foundation and multi-generational biological strategy. Where Cthulhu cults maintain knowledge passively, awaiting cosmic cycles, the Dagon cult actively breeds hybrid population, creating biological bridge between species. Where Yog-Sothoth worship attracts individual seekers, Dagon worship captures entire communities through economic dependency and genetic contamination. The cult is simultaneously most pragmatic, began as business arrangement, and most inescapable, writes itself into followers' DNA. Innsmouth demonstrates cult as sustainable system rather than apocalyptic movement. It has persisted almost a century when Olmsted investigates, will continue indefinitely barring external intervention. The 1928 federal raid that Olmsted mentions, authorities finally responding to decades of reports, temporarily disrupted the order but could not eliminate it. You cannot arrest biology. Deep One hybrids outside Innsmouth remained undetected, transformation occurring on schedule, regardless of organizational suppression. The cult persists cellularly, in bloodlines dispersed across New England, awaiting expression. This makes The Shadow over Innsmouth the most pessimistic cult narrative. It suggests contamination that can never be purged, worship embedded so deeply in biology that consciousness becomes irrelevant. Your body worships even if your mind refuses. Having examined these two major narratives in detail, we turn to how later writers and Lovecraft's own circle expanded the cult concept beyond his original formulations. August Derleth's posthumous stewardship of Lovecraft's work, beginning with the 1939 founding of Arkham House, profoundly altered cult cosmology. Through systematization, Lovecraft himself avoided. Derleth imposed dualistic moral framework, good elder gods opposing evil old ones, that contradicted Lovecraft's cosmic indifferentism. In Derleth's The Return of Hastur, 1939, and The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, cults serve deliberately malevolent entities engaged in cosmic warfare, making cultists straightforward villains rather than tragic truth-seekers. This revision made stories more conventionally publishable, but philosophically diluted. Derleth's cults could be defeated through counter-ritual, through invoking elder gods' protection, through moral conviction, precisely the redemptive structures Lovecraft had eliminated. Despite these alterations, Derleth's publishing efforts preserved and popularized the mythos, ensuring subsequent generations encountered Lovecraft's work, even in modified form. Robert Bloch contributed The Starry Wisdom Sect, featured in The Shambler from the Stars, 1935, and The Haunter of the Dark, 1936. The Starry Wisdom Church operated from Providence Building, using a shining trapezohedron, crystalline artifact permitting vision across dimensions, to contact Nyarlathotep Avatar. Bloch's innovation involved technological mediation. The cult employed physical device rather than purely psychic or ritual methods. The trapezohedron functioned as communication instrument, suggesting cult worship could evolve technologically. This anticipated later developments where cults utilize modern methods, computers, surveillance networks, genetic engineering, while pursuing ancient goals. Bloch also emphasized the church's historical persistence. Founded in Providence in 1844, it survived periodic suppression until final dissolution in 1877, only to leave artifacts that contaminated future generations. The pattern of recurring cult presence, despite authorities' suppression efforts, became standard trope. Ramsey Campbell relocated Mythos to England in stories written from the 1960s onward, creating specifically British cult manifestations. His The Church in High Street, 1962, featured congregation worshipping Yogolonak, entity inhabiting those who read certain forbidden texts. Campbell emphasized psychological horror over cosmic scale, making cults operate through ordinary social institutions, churches, libraries, civic organizations. The British setting allowed exploration of older architectural and cultural strata. Campbell's cults often trace lineage to pre-Roman Britain, to druids and bog sacrifices, giving them temporal depth exceeding even Lovecraft's New England antiquarianism. Campbell also pioneered unreliable narrator technique, where readers gradually realize the protagonist has already joined cult without consciously recognizing conversion. Thomas Ligotti's philosophical pessimism, evident throughout his career, but crystallized in works like The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, 2010, transformed Lovecraftian cult concepts into explicit antinatalist and nihilist philosophy. Ligotti's fictional cults worship not entities, but entropy itself, consciousness as cosmic mistake, existence as horror requiring termination. Stories like The Last Feast of Harlequin, 1990, feature cults pursuing deliberate extinction, viewing non-existence as ultimate enlightenment. This strips supernatural elements entirely. Ligotti's cultists are not contacting alien gods, but recognizing that reality itself, properly understood, justifies despair. His work demonstrates how Lovecraft's cosmic indifferentism, taken to logical conclusion, produces philosophical pessimism indistinguishable from cult theology. The cultist and the pessimist philosopher worship the same void using different vocabularies. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published by Kaon Inc. in 1981, systematized cult mechanics into playable rules. The game codified cult structure, providing templates for organization, recruitment methods, ritual systems, and entity-specific worship practices. This gamification required making implicit elements explicit. How many cultists constitute viable cell? What resources do they require? How do investigators detect cult activity? The game's influence on subsequent Lovecraft interpretation cannot be overstated. Generations encountered the mythos first through gaming, absorbing rule-systematized versions that made Lovecraft's deliberately ambiguous cults into statistically defined organizations. The sanity mechanic, where encountering cosmic horror gradually erodes mental stability, gamified the knowledge as poison concept, making psychological destruction measurable and mechanical. Academic appropriations beginning in the 1990s treated Lovecraftian cults as serious philosophical constructs. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, analyzed cosmic horror as legitimate ontological position rather than fiction genre. Thacker examined how Lovecraft's cults articulate the world without us, reality persisting indifferent to human extinction, making them proto-environmental and post-humanist. Graham Harmon's Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy, 2012, applied object-oriented ontology to Lovecraft's work, arguing that his cults recognize objects exist independent of human perception, that worship acknowledges this mind-independent reality. These readings transform cult members into philosophers who happen to be correct, their madness constituting clarity that consensus reality cannot accommodate. Modern media adaptations continue evolving cult concept. HBO's True Detective, first season, 2014, featured Tuttle family cult, combining Lovecraftian cosmic horror with Southern Gothic, suggesting powerful families maintaining worship across generations through economic and political dominance. Bloodborne, 2015, portrayed Healing Church as scientific religious organization pursuing biological ascension through contact with great ones, combining Lovecraftian entities with body horror and Victorian aesthetic. These adaptations demonstrate cult concepts' flexibility. It accommodates modern settings, diverse cultural contexts, varied media forms while maintaining core structure, organization preserving forbidden knowledge, pursuing goals that violate consensus reality, operating simultaneously as victims and perpetrators of cosmic horror. The collaborative expansion across 80 years transformed Lovecraft's cults from literary device into cultural template. contemporary conspiracy theories, doomsday movements, and fringe belief systems often mirror Lovecraftian structure, claiming access to hidden knowledge, predicting apocalypse on cosmic timescale, maintaining alternative historical narratives, interpreting mainstream dismissal as proof of suppression rather than evidence of error. The cult has escaped fiction, becoming analytical framework for understanding how groups organize around epistemically isolated worldviews. Whether this validates Lovecraft's insight into cult psychology or demonstrates his influence contaminating actual belief formation remains ambiguous. Precisely the ambiguity his fiction always maintained. Having traced cult concept through literature, we must now examine its afterlife in culture at large, where fictional cults sometimes become difficult to distinguish from actual ones. The Necronomicon's transformation from fictional grimoire to supposedly real text demonstrates how Lovecraft's constructed mythology achieved life independent of authorial intent. By the 1960s, libraries reported regular requests for the book from patrons convinced of its existence, despite Lovecraft's explicit statements that he invented it. The bibliographic detail he provided, Abdul al-Hazred's authorship around 730 CE, Greek translation by Theodorus Philetus in 950, Latin edition by Olaus Wormius in 1228, holdings at Miskatonic University, Harvard's Widener Library, the British Museum, created plausibility that mere assertion of fictionality could not dispel. In 1967, occultist and prankster Timothy Darch Smith planted Necronomicon cards in British Museum catalogue, further blurring reality boundaries. Researchers would discover these entries, assume legitimate provenance, cite the book in their own work, creating circular validation. The Simon Necronomicon, published by Schlanger Craft Inc. in 1977, capitalized on this confusion by producing actual grimoire claiming basis in Lovecraft's fictional text. Editor Simon, pseudonym for Peter Lavender, presented it as Sumerian magical work that Lovecraft had somehow accessed, mixing genuine Mesopotamian mythology with invented rituals supposedly drawn from Mad Arab's original. The book sold over 800,000 copies, becoming one of most successful occult publications of the 20th century. Readers performed rituals from it, reported results, incorporated it into magical practice. Whether these practitioners believed in literal Cthulhu or treated the Necronomicon as psychological technology became irrelevant. The book functioned operationally, regardless of ontological status. Chaos magic practitioners in the 1980s explicitly adopted Lovecraftian entities as thought forms, arguing that fictional gods work as well as traditional ones if sufficiently charged with belief. Online communities throughout the 1990s and 2000s claimed genuine Cthulhu cult membership, often ironically, but with irony, gradually becoming ambiguous. Forums like alt.horror.sothulu mixed literary discussion with role-playing as cultists, which sometimes slipped into seemingly sincere occult practice. The SCP Foundation, collaborative fiction wiki, launched in 2008, adopted Lovecraft's documentary style wholesale, presenting supernatural anomalies as classified documents, complete with redactions, footnotes, and bureaucratic language. Some entries explicitly reference mythos entities, others use similar structures for original creations. The project demonstrates Lovecraft's techniques now constitute recognizable genre conventions that amateur writers can deploy fluently. The boundary between fiction, roleplay, and genuine belief remains deliberately permeable. urban legends emerged claiming actual Deep One hybrids in coastal communities, actual forbidden texts in rare book collections, actual government suppression of cult activity. These legends typically combine Lovecraftian elements with conspiracy theory structure, sealed archives, mysterious deaths of researchers, officials refusing comment. After the 2005 discovery of the Denisovan hominins, previously unknown human relatives identified through DNA evidence, some internet commentators suggested paleontological cover-up of non-human intelligent species, explicitly referencing Lovecraft's Antarctic elder things. The legends function regardless of believers' numbers. Their persistence demonstrates Lovecraftian cosmology, provides ready-made framework for explaining anomalies, gaps in official narratives, experiences that consensus reality cannot accommodate. The satanic panic of the 1980s occasionally conflated Lovecraft with genuine occult danger. Fundamentalist Christian publications warned about role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons and Call of Cthulhu, claiming they initiated players into actual demon worship. Jack Chick's Dark Dungeons Tract, 1984, depicted D&D leading to real magical power and ultimately suicide, while other religious materials claimed Cthulhu represented actual demonic entity disguised through fiction. These warnings treated fiction as dangerous threshold. Reading about forbidden knowledge might constitute performing ritual. Entering imaginative space might permit spiritual contamination. The concern reveals anxiety about fiction's power to reshape consciousness, worry that sustained engagement with horror mythology might produce effects indistinguishable from belief. Philip K. Dick's late-period experiences, particularly his 1974 Valise contact event, suggest science fiction writers' consciousness contaminated by his own fictional constructs or by something those constructs accurately described. Dick spent final years of his life interpreting bombardment of visions and synchronicities, producing thousands of pages in his exegesis, attempting to understand what contacted him. He referenced Lovecraft repeatedly, wondering if cosmic horror writers were receiving transmissions rather than inventing stories. Dick's experience demonstrates potential recursion. Create sufficiently convincing fictional cosmology, spend years elaborating it, consciousness begins accepting it as description of actual metaphysics. The writer becomes first cultist of his own invented religion, or discovers his inventions were not inventions at all. These hoaxes and sightings reveal cultural hunger for hidden knowledge, alternative cosmologies, explanations that validate feelings of cosmic insignificance. Modernism produces, but rationalism cannot acknowledge. Lovecraft's cults provided structure for this hunger, frameworks that feel simultaneously ancient and contemporary. They persist because they articulate something consensus reality excludes, the suspicion that official narratives are comfortable lies, that truth exists beyond permitted discourse, that communities preserve knowledge the mainstream has deliberately forgotten or suppressed. The fictional cult becomes template for any marginalized belief system, any group claiming access to truths that authority refuses to recognize. This makes Lovecraft's literary invention dangerous in ways he never intended, useful in ways he might have appreciated. Film adaptations of Lovecraftian cults have struggled with inherent cinematic problem. Showing cosmic horror too clearly diminishes it, while leaving it vague risks incoherence. Stuart Gordon's Dagon, 2001, confronted this by focusing on Innsmouth's esoteric order, depicting gradual transformation of Spanish fishing village into deep one breeding ground. The film emphasized body horror, characters' metamorphosis shown through practical effects, gills tearing through skin, bone structure reshaping, making biological cultism visceral rather than metaphorical. The cultists appear reasonable from their perspective. They have achieved immortality, economic security, and evolutionary transcendence. The protagonist's horror stems from recognizing his own inevitable transformation, genetic destiny he cannot escape. Gordon understood that Lovecraftian cults work cinematically when presented as rational communities with different baseline assumptions about reality, rather than as conventional villains. The Call of Cthulhu, 2005, produced by H.P. Lovecraft. Historical Society, as silent film, using 1920s techniques, took opposite approach by embracing period-appropriate restraint. The Louisiana cult ceremony appears briefly, figures dancing around fire in swamp darkness, faces deliberately obscured. The film never shows Cthulhu clearly, only suggestions of immensity, wrongness of geometry, psychic pressure that drives witnesses mad. This restraint proved more effective than modern CGI attempts to visualize entities meant to be incomprehensible. The cult functions through testimony and artifact rather than direct depiction, mirroring Lovecraft's narrative technique of multiple sources reporting impossible consistency. HBO's True Detective, first season, 2014, transplanted Lovecraftian cult structure into prestige television, creating the Tuttle family and their Yellow King worship. The show explicitly borrowed from The King in Yellow and Lovecraft, depicting multi-generational Louisiana cult protected by political and economic power. Detectives Russ Cole and Martin Hart investigate ritual murders spanning decades, discovering that prominent citizens maintain worship through charity foundations, schools, and churches. The series brilliantly captured cult persistence, suppressing visible manifestations while underlying structure remains intact, protected by institutional authority. Cole's final monologue about black stars and losing oneself in contemplation suggests investigators' contamination by cosmic perspective, the detective becoming what he pursued. The show demonstrated Lovecraftian themes could sustain long-form narrative while appealing to audience unfamiliar with source material. Video game adaptations leverage interactivity to make players complicit in cult mechanics. Bloodborne, 2015, features Healing Church, organization that discovered Great Ones, ascended beings existing in higher dimensional space, and pursued communion through blood ministration. The player character gradually uncovers that Church's medical mission conceals experiment in forced human evolution, that healing serums contain Great One blood, that entire city of Yarnum has been biological laboratory for ascension attempts. The game's multiple endings include character achieving their own ascension, becoming infant Great One, ultimate cult conversion, where player chooses apotheosis over humanity. The interactivity makes philosophical questions mechanical. Do you pursue truth, knowing it transforms you, or maintain comfortable ignorance? Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005. Gamified sanity mechanics, making investigation literally dangerous to player characters' mental stability. Encountering cults, reading forbidden texts, witnessing supernatural phenomena depletes sanity meter, inducing hallucinations, and eventually permanent psychosis. The game captured epistemic danger, knowledge that damages the knower, by making research tactically costly. Players must balance information gathering against psychological preservation, Replicating investigators' dilemma in Lovecraft's stories, the cult becomes hazard to perception itself, not merely to physical safety. Music appropriations span genres but concentrate in extreme metal, where Lovecraftian themes align with sonic extremity. Metallica's instrumental, The Call of Cthulhu, 1984, introduced cosmic horror to thrash metal through atmospheric progression, suggesting vast approaching presence. The song contains no lyrics. The horror operates purely through musical architecture, building tension that never resolves into comprehensible form. Death metal band Morbid Angel named albums after Mythos elements, Altars of Madness, Blessed Are the Sick, Covenant, while lyrics invoke Lovecraftian entities as representations of chaos and entropy the genre philosophically embraces. Australian band Portal performs in hooded robes, suggesting cultist aesthetic, their music deliberately disorienting and claustrophobic, creating sonic equivalent of non-Euclidean architecture. Black metal's philosophical alignment with cosmic nihilism made Lovecraft natural reference point. Norwegian band Immortal's lyrics about Blashurk, frozen wasteland ruled by inhuman forces, mirror Antarctic elder things civilization. The genre's emphasis on anti-humanism, on forces that predate and will outlast humanity, directly parallels Lovecraft's cosmicism. Some practitioners approach this performance ironically. Others appear philosophically committed to cosmic insignificance as genuine worldview. The ambiguity mirrors cult dynamics. Belief and performance become indistinguishable through sustained enactment. Neofolk and dark ambient genres constructed entire aesthetic around occult knowledge and forbidden texts. Artists like Atrium Coxery create hour-long soundscapes suggesting abandoned facilities, ritual spaces, and dimensional thresholds, audio environments for cosmic horror that listeners inhabit rather than merely hear. These albums function as secular liturgy for imagined cults, providing ritual soundtrack without requiring belief in literal entities. The music creates psychological space where Lovecraftian concepts feel experientially real regardless of ontological commitment. Gaming and music adaptations succeed when they translate cosmic horror's philosophical core rather than merely referencing its iconography. Effective adaptations recognize that Lovecraftian cults are not obstacles to overcome, but epistemological positions to inhabit, perspectives that cannot be defeated because they might be empirically correct. The medium's immersive capacity, games requiring sustained engagement, music surrounding consciousness, allows audiences to experience cult worldview from inside rather than observing it externally. This experiential quality explains why interactive and auditory media often adapt Lovecraft more successfully than passive visual media. They permit gradual contamination, voluntary conversion through sustained attention. The player who spends 80 hours exploring Yarnum, or the listener who absorbs 3-hour dark ambient album about Arlia, emerges changed, having spent enough time in cold headspace that return to normal consciousness requires deliberate effort. Chaos magic practitioners in the 1980s and 1990s explicitly incorporated Lovecraftian entities into ritual practice, treating fictional gods as equally valid as traditional pantheons. Magicians like Phil Hine and Peter Carroll argued that deities function as psychological constructs regardless of historical pedigree. Cthulhu works as effectively as Odin if sufficient belief energy is invested. This approach, outlined in texts like Condensed Chaos, 1995, reframed Lovecraft's cults as experimental magical technology. Practitioners reported using Necronomicon rituals adapted from Simon's grimoire or self-constructed based on story details, claiming results indistinguishable from traditional ceremonial magic. The ontological question, are these real entities or psychological projections, became irrelevant to chaos magic philosophy. What matters is operational effectiveness, not metaphysical status. This pragmatism mirrors the esoteric order of Dagon's transactional worship, religion as technology rather than truth claim. Philosophical pessimism found Lovecraft's cosmic indifferentism compatible with anti-natalist and nihilist positions. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, analyzed cosmic horror as legitimate philosophical stance, not mere literary genre. Thacker examined how Lovecraft's cults articulate the world without us, reality continuing utterly indifferent to human extinction, universe that never required our presence and will not notice our absence. This philosophical reading treats cultists as people who have accepted cosmicism's logical conclusions. If universe lacks inherent meaning, if consciousness is anomalous accident, if humanity occupies no privileged position, then worship of indifferent cosmic forces represents honest acknowledgement rather than perverse choice. Thomas Ligotti extended this in The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, 2010, arguing that optimism requires self-deception, that clear-sighted recognition of existence's horror produces worldview indistinguishable from Lovecraftian cult theology. Academic horror studies legitimized Lovecraft as subject of serious scholarship beginning in the 1990s. S.T. Joshi's biographical and critical work established Lovecraft studies as viable field, while China, Mieville, and others examined political and philosophical dimensions. Graham Harmon's Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy, 2012, applied object-oriented ontology, arguing that Lovecraft's cults recognize objects exist independent of human perception, that cultists are proto-philosophers who happen to be correct about mind-independent reality. This academic appropriation recasts what appears as madness in the stories as philosophical sophistication, cult membership as achieving insights that phenomenology and post-Kantian philosophy labor toward through abstraction. The cultist and the continental philosopher pursue similar recognition that human access to reality is severely limited, that vast domains exist beyond subjective experience. Post-colonial readings examine Lovecraft's cults as manifestations of racial and colonial anxiety. Critics note that cultists disproportionately belong to marginalized groups, immigrants, people of color, non-Western cultures, while investigators are typically white Anglo-Saxon Protestants defending rational modernity. The cult becomes a repository for everything dominant culture excludes: non-Christian religion, non-European knowledge systems, miscegenation anxieties, fear of reverse colonization. This reading acknowledges Lovecraft's racism while finding value in how his cults inadvertently critique Enlightenment universalism. The cultists preserve knowledge that Western rationalism dismissed as superstition, maintain cultural continuity that colonialism attempted to erase, and ultimately prove correct within narrative logic, suggesting limitations of modernist epistemology even as Lovecraft personally endorsed it. Religious studies, scholars approach Lovecraftian cults as anti-theology, worship structured around meaninglessness. Where traditional religions posit cosmic justice, benevolent deities, or redemptive suffering, Lovecraft's cults worship entities that validate despair. This inverts religious function. Rather than providing comfort, meaning, or moral framework, these cults offer certainty about meaninglessness, community based on shared recognition of cosmic indifference. Some scholars argue this makes Lovecraftian cultism more philosophically honest than traditional religion. It does not promise what cannot be delivered, does not anthropomorphize forces that operate without human-level consciousness, does not pretend universe cares about human ethical categories. The cult becomes religion purged of comforting lies, spiritual practice for universe that offers no salvation. Fan communities blur boundaries between literary appreciation and performative cultism. The Church of the Subgenius, founded in 1979, incorporated Lovecraftian elements into satirical religious organization that simultaneously mocked and exemplified cult behavior. Similarly, online communities dedicated to Lovecraft often engage in playful cultist performance, referring to Lovecraft as master, posting I responses, treating fictional entities with mock reverence that sometimes appears indistinguishable from genuine devotion. This ironic worship raises questions about belief formation. If you perform cultist behavior sufficiently, does the performance become sincere? Internet culture's irony-sincerity collapse makes such distinctions increasingly meaningless. Someone might begin posting cultist rhetoric as joke, continue because it's entertaining, then discover they have internalized worldview they initially mocked. The SCP Foundation represents most sophisticated fan appropriation of Lovecraftian cult methodology. This collaborative fiction wiki, active since 2008, presents anomalous objects and entities through bureaucratic documentation style. The Foundation itself functions as anti-cult cult, organization attempting to secure, contain, protect humanity from cosmic horrors through classification and containment procedures. But many SCP entries suggest containment is temporary, that some entities cannot be permanently neutralized, that Foundation personnel risk psychological contamination through sustained exposure. The project demonstrates how Lovecraft's techniques, false documentation, fragmented narratives, ambiguous reliability, now constitute recognized genre conventions that thousands of amateur writers deploy fluently. The collaborative nature mirrors how Mythos developed through correspondence circle, multiple authors contributing to shared mythology without central authority. These subcultural appropriations demonstrate Lovecraftian cult concepts, flexibility, and persistence. They adapt to chaos magic, academic philosophy, post-colonial critique, ironic internet culture, collaborative fiction, maintaining core structure while accommodating radically different contexts. The cult endures because it articulates something recurring: the suspicion that consensus reality is curated fiction, that marginalized groups might preserve truths mainstream culture rejects, that knowledge exists beyond officially sanctioned epistemology. Whether deployed sincerely or ironically, literally or metaphorically, the Lovecraftian cult provides framework for communities organizing around excluded knowledge. This brings us finally to examining why these fictional constructs continue resonating psychologically and philosophically in contemporary culture. Cults persist in horror because they organize the unorganizable, making cosmic horror social rather than solitary. Lovecraft's protagonists typically encounter incomprehensible entities alone, experiencing isolation that compounds terror. No one will believe them. No framework exists for processing what they've witnessed. Cults solve this problem by providing community of shared experience, vocabulary for the ineffable, ritual structures that make horror manageable through repetition. The cult member is never alone with terrible knowledge. Others have seen the same things, reached similar conclusions, developed coping mechanisms. This communal aspect explains why people join actual fringe belief groups despite social stigma. Better to be collectively wrong with supportive community than individually correct in isolation. Lovecraft's cults capture this psychological dynamic, the relief of finding others who validate your perception, even when that perception is apocalyptic. The appeal of certainty in meaningless universe motivates cult membership across fictional and actual contexts. Existential philosophy confronts meaninglessness through constructing subjective meaning, accepting responsibility for creating value in an indifferent cosmos. Lovecraft's cultists choose opposite approach, accepting meaninglessness absolutely, aligning with cosmic forces rather than asserting human significance. This eliminates existential anxiety by eliminating the problem. If nothing matters, then failure to matter cannot be personal failing. The cult member achieves peace through surrender, abandoning the exhausting pretense that human concerns possess cosmic importance. For readers experiencing modern anomie, social fragmentation, or ecological dread, this philosophical position offers perverse comfort. You are not failing to find meaning. Meaning was never available. Your insignificance is not personal inadequacy, but accurate cosmological assessment. Modern resonances with technology, cultism, demonstrate how Lovecraftian structures manifest in secular contexts. Silicon Valley's valorization of disruptive innovation, of moving fast and breaking things, of accepting inevitable technological transformation. These mirror cult theology of aligning with irresistible forces rather than maintaining humanistic values. Effective accelerationists who argue for embracing technological change regardless of social consequences sound remarkably like Cthulhu cultists preparing for Old One's return. The transformation comes whether we resist or not. Better to position ourselves advantageously than futilely oppose. The cult of artificial superintelligence, worrying about machine entities whose concerns will be incomprehensible and whose power will be absolute, directly parallels worship of Old Ones. Even terminology overlaps. AI researchers discuss alignment problem precisely as cultists discuss aligning with cosmic forces. Political movements exhibit Lovecraftian cult characteristics when they construct alternate epistemologies resistant to falsification. QAnon demonstrated this structure perfectly. Hidden knowledge, accessible only to initiates, symbolic language, the storm, the plan, trust in cryptic communications from mysterious source, interpretation of mainstream dismissal as proof of conspiracy's reach rather than evidence of error. The movement's eschatological dimension, awaiting revelation when truth will be unveiled and enemies destroyed, mirrors cosmic horror's apocalyptic patience. Followers experienced communal certainty, shared interpretive framework, relief of having explanation for societal chaos. That the explanation was demonstrably false mattered less than its psychological utility. Lovecraft's cults function identically. Internal coherence and communal validation outweigh external verification. Conspiracy thinking more broadly adopts Lovecraftian cult epistemology. The conspiracist positions themselves as investigator, uncovering hidden truths, encounters, evidence that appears to form pattern, concludes that official narratives are comfortable lies, concealing terrible reality. This exactly replicates trajectory of Lovecraft's protagonists, except conspiracist never reaches the final revelation that destroys sanity. They remain in investigative phase perpetually, accumulating evidence, connecting disparate data points, believing they approach ultimate truth. The psychology is identical. Certain knowledge exists beyond official channels. Marginalized communities preserve it. Sustained investigation will reveal reality. Consensus denies. Whether one investigates Cthulhu cults or government cover-ups, the cognitive process and emotional satisfaction are indistinguishable. The cult of evidence itself deserves examination. Lovecraft's cults possess physical proof that validates their worldview. Artifacts, architecture, biological specimens. Contemporary culture faces explosion of available evidence combined with epistemic crisis about evaluating it. Anyone can find data supporting virtually any position. The question becomes which evidence to trust, which authorities to accept. Cult epistemology offers solution. Trust evidence that consensus reality dismisses. Validate your own perception against expert opinion. Form interpretive community that shares your assessment. This describes significant portion of contemporary discourse across political spectrum. We are all cultists of our preferred evidence now, worshipping data that confirms our cosmic horror while dismissing contrary information as contaminated by mainstream bias. Intellectual contagion through sustained attention explains why Lovecraft's work feels dangerous despite being fiction. Spend sufficient time analyzing cosmic horror, tracking references across stories, constructing coherent mythology from fragmentary evidence, and consciousness begins accommodating these frameworks. The scholar becomes vulnerable to what they study, not through supernatural infection, but through cognitive habituation. Your brain creates pathways for processing Lovecraftian concepts. Those pathways become easier to activate with repetition. Eventually, you find yourself thinking through cold logic even while consciously rejecting it. This is not metaphorical contamination, but literal neuroplasticity. Sustained engagement with any belief system reshapes cognitive architecture to accommodate that system's logic. Why we return to Lovecraft's cults, decade after decade, medium after medium, reveals something about contemporary psychological needs his fiction addresses. The cults articulate anxieties about hidden knowledge, about communities organizing around truths that authority denies, about the suspicion that consensus reality is constructed rather than discovered. They provide narrative structure for feelings of cosmic insignificance that modernity produces. Environmental collapse, suggesting human concerns, are trivial. Astronomical scales, rendering human timelines meaningless. Technological acceleration, creating sense of being swept along by inhuman forces. The cult offers response. Acknowledge insignificance. Align with inhuman forces. Find community in shared recognition that everything we were told about human importance was lie. The ultimate question Lovecraft's cults pose cannot be resolved. Is skepticism sanity, or is it comfortable blindness? The skeptic dismisses cult claims as delusion, maintains that scientific materialism adequately describes reality, trusts established epistemological authorities. The cultist claims direct perception of what skepticism cannot accommodate, maintains that materialism is incomplete or deliberately blinding, trusts marginalized knowledge against mainstream consensus. Lovecraft structured his fiction so both positions are simultaneously tenable and untenable. Perhaps most disturbing implication, by reading this analysis, by thinking seriously about cult epistemology for 14,000 words, by constructing frameworks for understanding belief systems organized around forbidden knowledge, have we not, in some sense, joined? The cult of cosmic horror studies is still a cult, organized around texts we treat as revelatory, pursuing knowledge that others dismiss as irrelevant or dangerous. We are inside the structure we thought we were analyzing. That ambiguity, that recursive trap where investigation becomes initiation, constitutes Lovecraft's most enduring contribution to horror. The terror of recognizing that you might have been a member all along.